Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Syed M. Raza Bokhari. Today I'm here with a new topic. That's a book review which was done by me. This book review is, this book is basically what I think is Science in Environmental Policy, Politics of Objective Advice by Campbell. And this book was one of the bestseller book for the students of environmental science and policy studies, and it gives a complex interplay between the environmental science and policy. So I'm going to start this book description as Campbell has been a celebrated writer, and she has given in-depth analysis on that particular group. So in her book, Science in Environmental Policy, The Politics of Objective Advice, Campbell examines the way scientists influence the policymaking process associated with two critical environmental challenges, acid rain and global climate change. According to Keller, scientists played a key role in agenda setting on acid rain and climate change, and both Roger Reveley and Savante Orden used a dramatic rhetoric by referring to climate change as a large-scale geophysical experiment and acid rain as chemical warfare. In her book provides useful background for readers to understand the complex interplay between scientists, politicians, and the general public, and supplies an interesting interpretation for them to understand how such an interplay influences or even defines policymaking. Keller's also explore how existing legislation, institutional arrangements, social norms, and organization structure and personality of the scientists affect the scientist's value position, credibility, and contribution in the policy making process. Keller proposes the scientific finding, and by extension, scientists themselves have diminishing power along the process of policy making. In other words, scientists are more influential in the early phases of policy making continuum. That is, agenda setting can only be influenced the legislation to a limited extent and are completely toothless in the actual implementation process. She also offers a specific example in her book to refute John Kingdon's competing hypothesis that technocrats, including environmental scientists, are expert in devising the details of policy, but politicians are the drivers of agenda setting. Keller concedes that such patterns are not absolute. Her narratives of the creation of the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program is an excellent case study which illustrates how a research institution has continued to shape American acid rain policy in the later phase of legislation implementation. Keller also argued against the silly myth of rational idea and emphasizes that no human being, including scientists who study a particular environmental issue throughout their entire career, can provide opinion on policy making with pure objectivity. Keller wants us to realize that every policy-making process is political. Everyone is the prisoner of his or her regime, and scientists are not an exception to this reality. How a false presumption of scientific objectivity on environmental issues fosters the practice of accepting some scientists' polarized opinion as a potentially natural fact. Keller believes that such practice is dangerous and undemocratic, as it might impede public participation and involvement in policymaking process. Keller argues that the demand for neutrality, objectivity raise the policymaking moves along the continuum which sets the bar too high for most scientists, and that are procedural constraints that become increasingly important as the policy process evolves. As such, few scientists can express their findings without the interference of their own political and moral values. Keller also explores the constraints and restrictions that impede scientists to participate and to influence the policy making of environmental issues. She explains that many scientists who work in the academic institutions live in ivory towers and are unwilling to expand their self-defined mission of knowledge creation to dissemination. Many consider the questions of interesting group representation in a hostile environment as either humiliating or intimidating. In other words, many scientists do not want to get their hands dirty. She also explains the scientists working in the government self-limit their roles as the pure technocrat for the same reason. The government tacitly enforces such stereotypes. For instance, the Environmental Protection Agency has a firewall policy its enforcement staff, research and development staff, scientific advisory, and external EPA-funded scientists. This policy certainly has many merits as it proactively prevents conflicts of interest, but it also impedes the free flow of information between scientists and the policymakers in the EPA, thus hindering scientific contribution to the implementation of environmental policy. Keller also expresses concerns about the tension between the ideals of scientific objectivity in decision-making and the limit practice of actually using science in policy. She explains that the increasing use of science in policy making can achieve two important goals. One is the rational goal of ensuring that decision correctly linked means the end ends. The other is the democratic goal of ensuring broad participation, which relies on different sets of criteria for evaluating good decision making and places less emphasis on finding the correct solution. Having recognized the challenges to increasing scientist influence, Keller suggests that the low-hanging fruit is again the agenda-setting stage. Scientists can achieve more than casual storytelling. They can raise public awareness of the urgency and significance of an incoming crisis. Certainly, all prophets, including the brightest scientists, must face lingering scientific uncertainties and can be wrong. However, their narratives and predictions are challenged mildly by dissenting scientists. Most scientists feel comfortable in participating in policy making at this stage. If environmental issues reach the legislation stage in Parliament, scientists must strive to assume the role of guarding objectivity. Therefore, many prefer to rely on scientific consensus, avoid express their opinion upon request. In this stage, their narrative analysis and forecast are subject to constant attack in the hostile environment. These scientists must be prepared to defend such consensus in public, and few of them have the skills to do so, and many scientists cave in the process. Scientific community is vast and diverse, and the scientific consensus supported by the entire academia, if divided even minimally, can exacerbate the situation even further. Keller's narrative of global climate change is an excellent example. The consensus on global climate change took nearly decades to merge. It is generally believed that the consensus was not reached until 2007 when the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, UNIPCC, declared unequivocally that the climate change is due to large part to human influence. Even this consensus is often challenged. The support was substantially challenged by peer scientists on the grounds of some hard errors in the UNIPCC data collection and analysis. A broad scientific consensus is hard for politicians and publics to accept, and according to Keller, the scientific consensus on climate change implies an immediate action plan for effective control to stabilize atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gas emissions. Such an action plan might have a fundamental impact on our economy and society. Keller explains why this action plan, despite the attainment of scientific consensus, is too drastic to be politically feasible in all major countries, including Canada. In a nutshell, it is difficult for scientists to influence policy making in the legislation stage. This book also has its shortcomings, which are thus a reflection of Keller's analytical weakness in structuring policymaking in a proper framework. For example, the broad categorization of policymaking into three linear phases, that is, agenda setting, legislation, and implementation. Although valid, is oversimplified. Many argue that policy formulation is a different process than legislation, as such that they should be analyzed separately. At the very minimum, the post-implementation process of policy making, namely evaluation and termination, also has its unique dynamics, and Keller should have used a more comprehensive dynamic framework of interacting multiple functions rather than these simple three stages to analyze complex issues. Keller certainly appreciates the elegance of a richer framework for policymaking. She acknowledges that each step is neither linear nor discrete, and she notes that to highlight the role that context might play in shaping science policy interactions, I draw on work with that has roots in Harold Lasswell, division of policy process into multiple stages. It is quite puzzling that she does not adapt Lasswell's much richer framework. Instead, she heavily relies on the Kingdon simplified version without analyzing its deficiency. In a similar manner, Keller appreciates the dynamic nature of each step and acknowledges the equally important, however, are studies that highlight distinctive features of each stage and contribute to a dynamic understanding of the policy process in which actors, resources, and norms of participation changes from one setting to the next. However, Keller still analyzed the three steps of policymaking as if they were distinct and linear. This remains a significant limitation of her analysis. And furthermore, the quality of her book may have been enhanced if Keller had used personal interviews with participation in congressional hearing. Interviews would have been complemented her work and allowed readers to understand the motives of the scientists participating in policy settings. Without an interviews, readers can only perceive these scientists from indirect resources, and Keller's narrative scientists behave differently through the three phases of policymaking. Our readers might have difficulty in understanding what their motives are to do so. Keeping aside the limitations of the framework and purely empirical nature of her work, Science and Environmental Policy, The Politics of Objective Advice remains a well-organized book about the two crucial environmental issues of acid rain and global climate change. Keller's question of how scientists provide information to policymakers in their research field without prioritizing the issue is interesting. Her thoughtful insight and near-complete analysis of the boundaries between science and politics on environmental issues are quite valuable for both policymakers and scientists. This book can provide a great learning experience to a wide audience, especially students of environmental science, political science, and policy studies at the graduate level, as well as scientists, politicians, and segment of public interested in learning policy and science interaction. So this was a brief book review. Book is quite quite long, but the analysis I've given that the Keller is being very in-depth in describing the interaction of scientific community with the politicians, and it is basically up to the scientific community and politicians to make a proper policy or the statute for that matter to implement the rules and regulations which needs to be further implemented to control the greenhouse gases and acid rain problem. So this is a beautiful example of a book, and I'm going to finish my presentation right now, and I'm going to come up with the new presentation shortly. And all I want you to subscribe and like my channel, and I will be thankful to you guys. Have a nice day.